Show me an antique shop anywhere in Europe, and I'll show you one of these, a butcher's table. They're all over the place. Maybe it's because today's modern butchers have turned to composite materials. But they're interesting. And today we're at Upcountry, a shop in Royal Tunbridge Wells. And there are 3 on the floor to look at. This one is French, I'm told. It has a turned leg, a decorative front, a backsplash with a cast boar's head, and even a place for the butcher's knives. Now over here on the other side of the room is a table with an interesting story. If you take a look at it, you can see that there's like an arch here. And if you look closely at this nameplate, it's upside down. So I would expect that the butcher used this side when he started out, and then instead of throwing it out to replace it, he simply flipped it over and made use of this side. Now over in this room is another one, and it has additional drawers underneath, and they open from both sides, which is kind of a nice feature. Now the top on this one is a band of beech, and it has these metal brackets on the corner, which are typical of a lot of these. And often you'll find plugged holes where rods were placed through it to squeeze everything together, because the field of the cutting surface is actually end grain blocks, a couple inches square, of beech. Now a piece like this and this size is very heavy. So I think to make it more useful, we want to make one about half size. I think this is something we should have no trouble putting together.
And half size is what I made, except that the butchers of yesterday were a little bit shorter than we are. So I raised the height of the countertop to 37.5 inches. I made the butcher's block from a band of solid maple and the field from end grain maple. I also maintained the draw detail that makes it accessible from either side. Before we get started today, I want to take a moment to talk about shop safety. Be sure to read, understand, and follow all the safety rules that come with your power tools. Knowing how to use your power tools properly will greatly reduce the risk of personal injury. And remember this, there is no more important safety rule than to wear these safety glasses. Now, in preparation for the project, I spent a little time last night gluing up a couple panels of maple. The strips are 1 9/16 inches wide and about 1 5/8 inches thick. Now, I suppose if you didn't want to go through that trouble, you could go and buy a piece of commercial butcher's block and use it as is, or cut it up into strips to get that end grain effect. But if you make your own, once you reach this point, you have a blank that's about 3 feet long and just wide enough to fit in a 12-inch surface planer, which is where I want to go next, smoothing up the top and bottom surface. With the 2 blanks planed to 1 9/16 inches thick, I'm now ready to glue them to each other. Now, I must admit, I probably wouldn't have attempted to make up my own butcher's block if it wasn't for the new glues that are available today. They're one part, they're waterproof, and they clean up with water. The base for our butcher's block is made up of glued up pieces of poplar, and that gives it some mass. Now, I suppose I could have bought full thickness material, but you pay extra for that. By gluing together thinner pieces, you save money, and it really isn't that difficult. Now, here are 4 blanks for the legs, glued up and cured, but not square. So the first step is to plane the face surfaces so that they're parallel and the right thickness. Now, while I was at it, I ran the top rails through because they're the same thickness as the legs. The next step in the operation is to make the edges square to the face, and that's done at the joiner. The next step is to take the jointed edge and place it against the rip fence and make a pass through the saw. That way I know that the two edges are parallel and square. The last step in the squaring up operation is to plane that freshly sawn face. With one end square, I'll cut the legs to length. On the outside edges of the leg, there is a shoulder, and that supports the band around the butcher's block. And these extensions support the butcher's block itself. First, I want to make this shoulder cut at my table saw, which I've set up with a guide block to keep the piece away from the fence. To remove the rest of the material, I'm turning to my bandsaw. Nothing does a better job. I've clamped one of the legs to my workbench with this template on top. It's a piece of tempered hardboard, and I carefully cut some holes, which will be the guides against which this collar on my router will ride for the mortise cuts. I'm using a 1/2-inch straight cutter. This is for the lower rail. This layout up here is for the upper rail. Now the mortise is 1.25 inches deep. I'm going to make it in several passes, cleaning out each pass with the vac. Now there's one more notch I need to make in the leg, and that's to receive this side guide for the draw. And that's what this cutout in the template is for. The next step is to make the tenons on the ends of all the rails. I want to make a nice, clean, crisp cut on all 4 sides, then remove the rest of the material with my bandsaw, as I did earlier. Well, now just a little bit of work with my wood rasp to make a perfect fit. With all the tenons fitted, I'm ready for some assembly. A little bit of glue on the tenons and the mortises. Well, now let's go back to the butcher block. That joint I glued is sufficiently cured, and the next thing I want to do is trim one end so it's straight and square. Well, now with my rip fence set for a 2-inch cut, we'll rip some end grain. Well, now I'm ready to glue the strips of end grain together in 2 groups, 7 strips each. And I do that because it's much easier to clamp 7 pieces together than 14. One thing that I've really tried to do in gluing up these end grain blocks is try to keep them as even as possible, because trying to sand end grain even is very difficult. The next thing to do to the butcher block is make these slots which will hold the knives, and I do that at the table saw. Well, it's a lot easier to cut the knife slot out now than it is later. Well, here I'm using my sliding compound miter box to make perfect miters on the corners of the band that surrounds the field. The next step is to bevel the top inside edge of all 4 pieces. And that's part of a system to allow the field, when it expands, to rise up instead of pushing out against the miters, opening them up. So I've set my saw to a 5-degree angle, and I'll just run the pieces through. Now these slots will be for some number 20 biscuits, which will help hold the corners together. All right, well, I think we'll leave this in the clamps overnight because I want those joints to be nice and strong before I put any pressure on them. The last thing to do tonight is to glue the 2 halves of the field together. And with that, we'll be able to come back tomorrow and easily finish this project. Well, I thought I'd get started this morning where we left off last night, on the butcher block. What I want to do is remove any of the burn marks and unevenness. And this is an 80 grit belt. Now I've switched to my random orbit sander. I'm starting with an 80 grit, and I'll work my way down to finer and finer grits until I get all the scratches removed and a nice smooth surface. Here I flip the butcher block face down and run it through my saw, which is set at 10 degrees. Now that's a little bit bigger than the 5-degree angle that I used on the frame, so it'll be able to move around. All right, let's see how it fits. Okay. Well, that's not too bad. If you look underneath here, you'll notice that there's a slight gap around the edges, and that's because of the difference in the angles. Now I want to increase the saw angle to 30 degrees and cut another bevel on all 4 edges. Okay, now that's 30 degrees. I don't want to set the rip fence so that the bevel goes right to the very top edge. I want to leave about 5/8 to 3/4 of an inch at that 10-degree angle. Now for the acid test. The frame sits on the rails and the rabbets that are in the legs. The field, as I said earlier, is meant to sit on the top of the legs. Okay. Now, hopefully with those bevels, if the field should expand, it'll rise up a little bit instead of pushing the sides apart. Now back to the final details on the base. The first thing is to place the side guide for the draw into the mortises. Now this strip of maple will act as a draw support and guide, and I'll just attach that with some screws. Now this piece of maple will guide the top of the draw so that it won't tip out too much as it's opened. The bottom shelf is made up of 9/16-inch thick poplar, and I want to ease all the edges. So I've set up my router with a 1/4-inch rounding over bit, but I'm just going to use a portion of the bit just to knock those corners off. Now where the boards meet one another, I'm just going to use this little plane to chamfer the edge. And then I'll nail all the boards in place. And once I get all these nailed in place, we'll get to that drawer. Well, here are the parts for our drawer. 2 drawer fronts, 3/4 of an inch thick, 2 sides, a 1/2 inch thick, and a plywood bottom. First thing I want to do is make the groove for the plywood bottom. Now this is my dovetailing fixture, which has a number of adjustable fingers, which allows me to make just about any type of dovetail layout that I want. And it works with my router, which is set up with a collar and a dovetailing bit. The collar follows the fingers cutting the dovetails. First, I want to make the tails in the side pieces. you follow the directions that come with these dovetail fixtures, you'll be able to dovetail 1 or 100 draws perfect every time. Now with the draw front set in the correct position, I'm ready to cut the pins.
Well, this is an incredibly strong joint. Well, that just about does it. But before I install the hardware, I think I'll put the finish on this piece. I like to treat my butcher block with mineral oil. It's a good conditioner, keeping the wood from drying out. And it won't go rancid like some of the vegetable oils. I like to make sure that I put a coat on everything, including the band that goes around the edge. And every once in a while during use, I want to give it a treatment. Now for the base, I'm using a water-based stain that the manufacturer calls Spanish oak. It seems to be the closest thing we can find that approximates that English country pine. I'll put one coat on, let it dry, and then seal it with some urethane. Well, what do you think? Are we getting any closer to that English country pine look? I think those antique dealers in London better watch out. We're starting to learn their secrets.